Today is October 8th, 2024. This is episode 50 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Bowles, and as usual, I'm joined by Joe Mead. Tonight, Joe and I will go over the action from week 6, which involved a couple upsets, a lot of chaos, and then we'll preview week 7, which is by far the best slate of the year. And then at the end, we'll get into the coaches poll for men's basketball that came out just a day or two ago. So Joe, lots going on in the sports world right now. But let's talk about some college football that happened on Friday night. Oregon hosts Aiden Childs and Michigan State, and despite a couple of turnovers early, the Ducks get the job done, 31-10. Business as usual for the Ducks. We asked them not to trip up here, and they certainly did not do that.
No, Sean, I do think, though, with that said, there were some big concerns for Oregon early on. Turning it over twice in the red zone, pretty unacceptable. I think even the first drive going 3-and-out, and I think Michigan State's defense, we give Joe Rossi a lot of credit for it being improved. Going 3-and-out at home is not a great thing to do. And with Ohio State lingering next week, which we'll for sure preview later on, that's probably not the trend you want to do. Maybe you just got the hiccups out early, who knows? But one thing that's concerning, Dylan Gabriel's decision making, I do think it's a one-off, and he was probably trying to do a little too much. I thought some of the play calling at the beginning of the game, especially when Jordan James was gashing them, was pretty ridiculous to throw these passes within the 6-yard line. I thought that was pretty pointless. And the way they gashed Michigan State in the second half was more indicative of how that game should have gone. Now, on the flip side, for Michigan State, you probably could say the same thing. Aiden Childs completes the big pass to Nick Marsh on 4th and 2 from midfield. You're thinking, all right, Michigan State might make this a game. Fumbling on the 1-yard line. Sean, it's kind of the same thing we've talked about all year with Aiden Childs. I know that clip we had about 500 views, so 500 people have heard me say it, but the guy is so good. It's just the mistakes are so costly, and I think some Michigan State fans are somewhat fed up with it, and I could understand that. But at the same time, I don't think they have a true alternative. So I think having him in there is just growing pains, and I think you have to chalk it up to that, as I've said throughout September and now into October. But I thought Michigan State did some nice things. I thought they had a great eye for the ball. Some of those interceptions by Gabriel, they tracked him down perfectly. You could tell they're a lot better coached than they were last year. They're prepared for a lot of these passing plays. Ultimately, though, the defense was out there too long. The offensive line of Oregon was a complete mismatch for the front seven of Michigan State. And while they did, stuff a decent amount of runs, it didn't matter. They broke off too many big ones. And ultimately, that's all she wrote in this one, Sean. I just think Oregon right now as a program and as a team is significantly better than Michigan State. And if you're Michigan State, having those early mistakes by Aiden Childs, especially against competition like this, it's going to come back to bite you really quickly. And unfortunately, that's what happened for the Spartans.
Yeah, just one turnover for Childs today, which you have to say is a step in the right direction for the Michigan State quarterback. But talk about costly. I mean, they take the lead there, and who knows what happens here. But ultimately, they didn't, and it was 31-0 deep into this fourth quarter. Now, they do end up getting 10 there to make it look a little less ugly. They did cover 21.5, which is big for some people out there, but the end of the day, Michigan State probably needed a hero performance from multiple players to even make this close, and they didn't get that. All right, Joe, we'll move the calendar to Sunday. This game happened up in Happy Valley. UCLA heads across country for the first time in the Big Ten to face Penn State. Penn State rolls 27-11, and Joe, the score does not indicate how one-sided of a game this was. Penn State rolls. They're 5-0.
Sean, I want to make note of a few things. I think Penn State, and this is a credit to James Franklin and Andy Kolodnicki mainly, and it's not saying there's no credit to Tom Allen, considering his defense shuts down teams the whole game. Them before halftime in so many games, particularly West Virginia in this game, they're so lethal. I feel like they like being in 2-minute drills a lot more than running their normal offense. I don't know if that's going to help out in these bigger games, one that's coming up this weekend and another in 3 weeks, but it's something to keep an eye on. And I think UCLA and Illinois 2 weeks ago certainly kept an eye on it. this team is dangerous before the half. I think Drew Aller, I don't know if his deep ball is much better, but he's a lot more confident, which means he's going to throw it a lot more. And I think teams get paranoid about that before halftime. And Penn State's really taken advantage of that. On the UCLA side, I think Justin Martin actually had a heck of a game. I know putting up 11 points, only three in the first half, but he was making a lot of throws. I thought it's as difficult an atmosphere going into Happy Valley against a top seven team uh, as a first time starter to go in there and really deliver. And Justin Martin's effectively a freshman to be a sophomore. So I think UCLA could actually build off this performance on the bright side. I did think Eric Bieniemy's play calling was really good and helped Justin Martin out. Ultimately, though, the mistakes, the not getting out of 4th and 1 early, kind of similar to Michigan State. You need those plays to go your way early in the game to stay in it. And unfortunately for UCLA, they passed up on those opportunities. Penn State, I think, an impressive performance. I know UCLA got one on late, so I don't really consider this a 27-11. I do think they did not show a lot of things. Thinking that USC game was on paper going to be a bigger game, it's still going to be a huge game. And we'll talk about USC later on, Sean. But Penn State, you have to like where they're at right now, although you do feel it's somewhat incomplete due to the level of competition. But I do think this weekend we're going to learn a pretty good amount about Penn State. But as of right now, Sean, on a bigger level, they're probably the second or third most likely team in this conference, and maybe the second, just because Oregon and Ohio State are going to have to lose on Saturday to make the playoffs. So gotta like where they are just by staying undefeated and letting the rest of the country beat themselves up.
Yeah, that they have gone all the way up to fourth, and that is not because the UCLA victory was impressive. That's because a lot of teams lost. We saw Alabama, Tennessee, and then a couple teams in the Big Ten lose as well that were ranked. So they're in a good spot right now, and we'll get to it later. But they have, a couple of probably a couple losses that they could take and still make the playoff. But up next, Joe, is probably the most lopsided game of the weekend, and unfortunately for this team on the wrong end, it's more of the same. Wisconsin knocks off Ryan Welter's Purdue Boilermakers 52-6. Tough one for the Boilermakers here. Braden Locke impresses with 360 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. And Joe, there's not much to say here other than it's pretty clear Purdue quit on this game early, and you have to say it, they might have quit on the season already.
Yeah, Sean, it's funny. I think I put them just ahead of UCLA, and if I re-rank the teams, I'd tell you UCLA would be way in front of them, even if it was like if I had to do a this margin. Like clearly UCLA is still 17, but it's by a further margin.
Yeah, this
Um,
wouldn't happen to UCLA.
no,
They might
and
lose
I
by
think
30, but not
yeah,
46.
and I think UCLA had positives, like I just mentioned in the Penn State game. Purdue, there were no positives. The defense got dominated. The offense can't move the ball. They can't protect. I feel bad for Hudson Card. They can't protect him either. They don't really have a lot of weapons. I think Devin Mockabee's a really good player, but unfortunately, he's not going to get the spotlight he deserves, being on a team that's very likely to go 1-11, maybe if they're lucky 2-10. So for Wisconsin, I think it's just another game for Braden Locke getting more comfortable. I think if this didn't boost his confidence, there's not going to be a game on the schedule after this that would do so. I think just for Wisconsin, this was a get right game. They got right, and they got a big one coming up. So I don't think we have to complicate the message here, Sean.
Yep, the seat's getting a little hotter for Ryan Walters, and there's a chance that he may not even be the coach at the end of the season. But Purdue does not look like things are going to turn around there, and good for Wisconsin. They get themselves over 500. Up next, Joe, is Ohio State. They hosted Caleb Johnson and the Iowa Hawkeyes, and as we both predicted, the Buckeyes rolled 35-7, and for the most part, they did keep Caleb Johnson quiet, just 86 yards rushing. Cade McNamara struggled again, under 100 yards. Judkins, Henderson moved the ball pretty well on the ground for Ohio State, and from a lot of this game, it looked like this was going to be one of the more lopsided games of the weekend. Ohio State rolls Iowa.
Yeah, I thought Iowa in the first half, and I know I'm being overly positive to the teams that lost, and please don't think I'm going to do that to Michigan here. But Ohio State is probably the top 3 team in the country. Iowa was only down 7.5. Now I understand it was 7-0. It wasn't like a 21-14 where the offense showed out, but that speaks to the preparation and just how good Iowa's defense truly is. Unfortunately, the turnovers by Cade McNamara, the fumbles, and I don't think that's all on him. I think a lot of this is on the offensive line. And how comfortable could Cade really be back there when he's under duress from JTT, Sonny Styles, Jack Sawyer? I mean, the list goes on and on. I felt like everyone lived in that backfield at a certain point in that second half for Ohio State. But Ohio State, I was not too impressed in the first half. I do think in the second half, that's more the team we expected. I don't think Will Howard had his best game again, and it's preposterous to say, right? A guy with 4 TDs, only one pick, 21 to 25, had a bad game. But I do think there is some weaknesses on Ohio State's team, and I'm saying this for what they are. They're a national title contender, probably the most likely team in this conference to run the table. So they're going to be held to a higher expectation. I do still think they're by far the best team in this conference, and we'll talk about that when we preview the blockbuster matchup at the end of this episode. But I think as of now, Ohio State's kind of like Penn State. They just everything they've done it's been what we've expected. There's been a few weaknesses shown, but I struggle to find a team that's perfect in this country, including even Texas. I understand Quinn Ewers is out, but Ohio State's looked as impressive as ever, and this is the first time this week where we're going to see them against a ranked opponent, a team that we're going to really judge them against. So Iowa, all I'm going to tell you is the schedule gets a lot easier after this. So I think that's one bright spot you could take, even if you don't believe the propaganda some people accuse me of giving Cade McNamara and the Iowa offense.
And Joe, the a lot of teams are going to go to Ohio State and look pretty bad in there, and just need to shout out the wide receivers that they have are as good as it gets. Jeremiah Smith, the true freshman, and Emeka Egbuka, who is on his way to the National Football League. Ohio State's really good, and they're going to have a chance to prove it this weekend. Up next, Joe, is my Indiana Hoosiers. They go into Northwestern and win 41-24. This game was a little bit closer. Northwestern did come back to tie the game, or they got within 3 in the fourth quarter. They did not tie the game, but at the end of the day, Curtis Rourke and the Hoosiers get the job done in Evanston. Joe, Indiana's bowl eligible at 6-0. They're up to 18th in the AP top 25. We asked for them to make this a decisive victory, and that's kind of what they did.
Yeah, Sean, I thought a lot of this game, Indiana's offense, you never really believed Northwestern was going to come back, simply because I don't think they have the firepower Indiana does on offense. Elijah Surratt, I have not highlighted him as much individually, just because I've been more amazed by the coaching chops of Kurt Signetti and the brilliance and straight up competence, which is a word I don't say lightly, of Curtis Rourke. Indiana, I think one thing you highlight is maybe the defense. I think giving up 24 to Northwestern is somewhat concerning. But as of now, the offense shows no signs of slowing down. And at this stage, I think Indiana knows what they are. They're not a team that's going to win a game 13-10. They're not a team that's going to try to run down the clock and win like 21-17, like a Michigan, Iowa, or even a Penn State. They're a team that wants to score a lot, and they're not afraid to. And I think that's going to strike fear in a lot of their opponents coming up. Now, they do have the bye week, I believe.
Yep.
Before they play Nebraska, at Washington, and at Michigan State. Those are 3 games, on an individual basis, you think Indiana wins, but you look at those as the threesome, and I think that it gets really tough. All those teams pose different challenges, but as of now, no complaints about Indiana's performance, especially considering the talent and, frankly, the expectations, which I think are unfairly raised as of now simply because of the 6-0 start. I do think they deserve to be held in that light. I just think holding them to that fire is somewhat ridiculous. But as of now, Indiana looking good. A much not needed, but probably a welcomed bye week for the Hoosiers, and perhaps they could tighten up on defense and make their offensive arsenal even better.
Yeah, and Joe, Indiana does not have a game this week, so let's talk about kind of their long term and how they look now, because we're not going to talk about them again. But this game was kind of the same game as Maryland. It was a high-scoring game, which Indiana held them at arm's distance until pulling away at the end. And certainly Billy Edwards and Jack Lausch are not any sort of incredible quarterbacks. Like, they're all right, but there is some concern that a good quarterback might be able to pick apart this Indiana secondary. And, you know, there is a part of winning and trying to keep when you're winning and trying to keep the ball in front of you and giving up, some chunk plays at times. But those three teams up next, Joe, they all have good quarterbacks: Dylan Raiola, Will Rogers, and Aiden Childs. So if there is a way to beat Indiana, it is with a good passing quarterback. Which after those three, you won't see that from Michigan or Purdue, and you'll see it in 4 of the remaining 6 games. So whether they can win that is a problem. Nobody has come anywhere close to stopping this Indiana offense, and I'm not sure even some of the elite defenses will be able to really shut them down. Maybe you can keep them in the 20s, but at this point, it seems like what's going to give first is elite defense is going to slow down this Indiana offense, or is this Indiana defense just not going to be able to get stops? That's really what it comes down to for me.
Yeah, Sean, I completely agree. I do think if you made me pick right now, I would say Washington's an early candidate to upset Indiana. I do think, and it's funny because I'm siding with the great offense and great quarterback picks apart Indiana's defense. And I think great play caller too, which we'll talk about with Jed Fish. But Nebraska, who we're going to talk about, I know in a few seconds. I don't want to highlight their defense too much because I'm going to do that in that segment. But Nebraska's defense is a prime candidate to not shut down, but to limit Indiana's offense. And they've done it against Colorado, who has a very dynamic offense. They certainly did it on Saturday against Rutgers.
And Joe, that is the game that's up next for us. 14-7 Nebraska. The Cornhuskers knock off the Scarlet Knights. We thought this would be a sneaky good game, and some teams that really could catapult their seasons forward with a victory and not a whole lot of tough games ahead. It's the Cornhuskers. They go up 2 touchdowns at halftime, and then Rutgers just manages to get on the board with just about 4 minutes left. So, Joe, it wasn't the prettiest game for Dylan Raiola and the Huskers, but ultimately they leaned on their defense and they got the job done.
Yeah, I certainly think you're 1,000% correct, Sean. Dylan Raiola, after the game, was not happy with his performance. Clearly happy with the win, and I don't think he's a guy that's gonna like parade himself in front of the media and be like a poor me or oh I suck kind of guy, because that's not who he is. But I do think Nebraska's defense, Tony White deserves all the recognition in the world for this performance. Uh, they knew all they had to do was shut down Kyle Monangai, and they wanted to make Athan Kaliakmanis beat them in the air, something he couldn't do, especially when under duress from the black shirts. I do think Athan Kaliakmanis has been, without a doubt, a net positive for the Rutgers quarterback room, certainly their aerial attack and their offense as a whole. I do think Saturday was an example of his limitations. I don't think that he's a guy that will win you the game when Kyle Monangai is held ineffective, which is pretty much what he was. After the first few runs, where I think he broke like 2 or 3 14-ish yard runs, he was extremely ineffective. And I understand Greg Schiano alluded to this in the postgame. It was like 97 and windy in Nebraska, just abnormal weather conditions, especially for early October in that part of the country. But regardless, Sean, Rutgers offense could not do a dang thing. I don't think Kurt Shiraka is all at fault for the play calls. I do think he could have gotten a little more creative, but based on the type of game it was, I don't think he wanted to take a huge risk because Nebraska's 14-point lead, which they held most of the game, felt insurmountable. I can't imagine what a 3-score lead would have felt like. But Rutgers, ultimately, they scored with like 5 minutes left. I don't think this game was in much doubt. Maybe some of the paranoid Nebraska fans thought so. I really didn't, following along. And then after watching the highlights and the rerun, I did not think that Rutgers' offense felt they had any momentum. They were probably relying on Nebraska's offense to make a huge mistake, which they did not make, which I think shows not significant, but it shows progress from that Illinois game we watched 2 weeks prior. So really good on Nebraska. I do think coming up, this is going to be a defining stretch. Like Indiana, they do have a bye week. But looking at the bigger picture, at Indiana, at Ohio State, I understand those 2 games are going to be really challenging. They're going to be likely, both those teams will be top 15 when Nebraska goes there. But after that, UCLA at home, I think at USC will be tough, Wisconsin, and at Iowa. At 5-1, a bowl game certainly should be the bare minimum expectation. I do expect them to win 3 of these last 6 games. Maybe they do steal one. Maybe they steal one in Bloomington, steal one in at the Coliseum, or steal one at Iowa, similar to how they did 2 years ago. But a lot of the table for the Huskers, I think it would take a lot to make that playoff, but perhaps it could be on the table if they beat Indiana.
Yeah, it's a big win for them. You look at the rest of the year, and if you were to drop this one to Rutgers at home, you start thinking, oh, well, we get a fizzle out to a 7-5, and which certainly maybe would have been fine at the beginning of the year, but they've kind of been victims of their own success here early on with some pretty decent performances. But the sky's the limit for Nebraska. They really could do some damage. They have the two ranked games, as you said, and then a USC, and there's good teams on there where if they do happen to win all of them, or not the Ohio State game, but all the rest of them, you could see them probably in the top 15, maybe top 20 in the rankings. So a lot of room to grow for Nebraska. Rutgers, it's their first loss of the year. They did win by a field goal 2 weeks in a row, so you got to think if you keep playing close games, you're going to end up on the wrong side of one eventually. And then they've got a pretty similar schedule. They host UCLA, Wisconsin, so does Nebraska. They go to USC like Nebraska, and then Michigan State, Illinois, Rutgers, or Illinois, Maryland, and Minnesota. So winnable games for the Scarlet Knights as well. 2 games left on Saturday, Joe, and it's the 2 games that were deemed upsets. Now, the first one we're going to talk about technically was not, because the home team, the Washington Huskies, were slight favorites, and they knocked off your Michigan Wolverines 27-17. A lot to talk about from this one, but first, before we get into all the headlines, overall thoughts on the Huskies getting revenge for the national championship loss a year ago.
It's funny, Sean. I think the Rutgers segued perfectly into this segment. Rutgers, like Washington's, played a lot of close games. Rutgers has just been on the good side of things, and frankly, you could categorize Washington's opponent, Michigan, into that too. They've been in 3 close games, three games in a row. Their past 3 games have all been decided. First 2 by field goal, and this one, which went down to the wire. So I do think Washington learned a lot about itself. I think seeing that offense really perform, but I understand Will Rogers had his first pick of the year, Ernest Hausman. I did think the offense looked really comfortable. Will Rogers seemed as free as ever throwing the ball. It kind of seemed like he was in the prime of his air raid days with Mike Leach at Mississippi State. I think Jed Fish has really eased him as a quarterback. I think he's made it a lot easier. I do think his receivers, Giles Jackson, Jonah Coleman, had phenomenal games. And Jed Fish, man, those screen passes, whoever plays Washington, as an opposing fan being there in the stadium, there's nothing more frustrating than seeing Will Rogers flush back and then throw to a wide open receiver, running back, tight end, and block for 20 yards. That's something I've seen at Michigan.
Saw at the Giants too with Wink.
Yeah,
he definitely watched some NFL film from last year.
And he picked apart that Wink's defense doing that. But I've seen this from Jed Fish from his time calling plays at Michigan, UCLA, and Arizona. I think it's a consistent part of his offense. And I don't think teams fail to prepare for it. I think they fail to adjust to it in the game because it's so frustrating. And he'll go back to it until you give him an answer. And Michigan certainly could not do that. I do think Washington, their season's not dead at all. I think after the Rutgers game, fan morale was low. But after seeing that crowd at Husky Stadium, rushing the field, and as loud as ever, I'll tell you, it's one of the louder Big Ten stadiums I've ever been to. While there was 30 to 35% Michigan fans, so that speaks to how loud that fan base is. You look forward at Iowa, at Indiana, USC, at Penn State, UCLA, and at Oregon. Aside from the
tough
UCLA
schedule
game,
left.
That's tough, but
they may be underdogs in 5 of the last 6, definitely 4 of the last 6.
Yeah, Sean, but you look at that schedule, and I say even if they win 2 of those, that's probably a really good. I hate to say it, Sean, a really good 6-6 or even 7-5 if you're beating you beat a Michigan, you beat Indiana, Iowa. I don't think a Penn State, Oregon's on the table, but if you win 2 of those last 6 outside of UCLA, I think the fan base is more invested than they once thought after the Washington State and Rutgers game. And I'll say this: I think Jonah Coleman and Giles Jackson showed why Washington has one of the premier passing games in the conference. Sean, before I go to Michigan, I want your thoughts too.
I think Washington's a like a sneaky good team. They 3-2, lost to Washington State. You think, oh, this team's not any good, but they're favored over the number 10 team coming into their stadium here. There had to be something to that, and their offense is good. Will Rogers is a good quarterback, definitely one of the better ones in the conference. They have a couple weapons at receiver. And you talk about, I mean, they lost by a field goal at Rutgers and 5 points at Washington State. They're right there, and you have to give them credit. I do think they deserve to win this game, but Joe, you were right. They did win by 10, but it really could have gone either way there at the end. Tied with just a couple minutes left, and before a costly fumble by the new Michigan quarterback, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But um, they played a pretty good game, Washington, and then they made the plays down the stretch to get across the line. And they are definitely going to be the best whatever record team they have this year. And whether it's 6-6, 7-5, there's not going to be many teams with that record that are better than them. But Joe, we got to talk about it. Michigan, they have moved on to their third quarterback of the season. This time, it's former Indiana Hoosier Jack Tuttle. And Joe, he gave you some I guess some pizzazz offensively. He gave you some life, and ultimately a couple turnovers down the stretch. But at this point, you have to think Michigan are going with Tuttle from now on.
Yeah, I think there's a glass half full, glass half empty type Michigan fan. I'm more with the glass half empty, and I won't go on a scathing rant like I did about Michigan basketball because frankly, I could only do one of those a year, and 8-24 is a lot more of a reason to than a team that lost most of its starters. So I'll start with this. I think Jack Tuttle coming in was the spark the offense needed. One thing that is fair criticism, but also unfair criticism at the same time is if you knew he was healthy going into this game, and to be clear, our sources tell us he was not necessarily ready to go in against Minnesota, certainly not USC. But to wait to go down 14-0 and then put him in, I think is going to be looked at as a mistake no matter what, even if you want to defend or criticize Sharon. I do think once Washington went adjusted, they were playing the same defense they had for Orgy when Tuttle went in the game. Then at halftime they adjusted. After the kind of Johnny Manziel, JJ McCarthy like throw to Colston Loveland to give Michigan the 17-14 lead, Washington's defense just took over. They covered the routes. They knew Jack Tuttle can't throw the ball down the field that far. They pressed routes. They made him really uncomfortable. And frankly, Sean, I think Washington's defense deserves a lot of credit because they made Michigan's mistakes. Like there were three plays that could have changed the game. One was Donovan Edwards slipping on that second down where he had a wide open hole. The second was the Jack Tuttle fumble, and the third was the interception after Washington took the 24-17 lead. Each one of those mistakes probably wouldn't have been as costly if Washington didn't clamp down the entire second half. I thought once Michigan got the ball back up 17-14 after Washington had to punt from midfield and really couldn't protect Will Rogers, that this would be the game over if Michigan scored. Washington didn't even let Michigan get a first down after that until a pretty pathetic drive where Kalel Mullings had to like jump over the pack like 5 times because the the clock official and Michigan center couldn't get the damn ball snapped. So uh, I think there's a lot to like about Tuttle. I do think this was an incomplete performance and therefore an incomplete grade because this was his first real start. I think Michigan having the bye week's a really good thing. I think a lot of people love to criticize Wake, and I think it's one of the easiest things to do as a Michigan fan. I'm not going to be in the majority. I think when you're on the field the entire game, you're going to make mistakes. If all those mistakes are really bad, Sean, they're also entirely explainable because if you're out there 70 to 80% of the second half, like they've been the last 3 games, Sean, really bad things are going to happen. And this is the really bad thing that happened. The one bright side for Michigan looking forward, they're the highest ranked number 2 loss team. They do have the bye week to get guys like Colston, Loveland, Mason Graham, Will Johnson, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore completely or close to completely healthy before Illinois. But you look at this remaining schedule. Look at this, Sean. At Illinois, probably going to be a top 20 ranked team by the 19th. Michigan State, never an easy game. Oregon, who might be the number 2 ranked team if they beat Ohio State. At Indiana, who will probably be a top 15, top 20 team. Northwestern, that's not going to be too hard. I'll say that right now. And then at Ohio State, while there's a lot of opportunities to lose, there are a lot of opportunities to uh, build back your resume. And while I don't think a playoff appearance is likely, if you even go 5-1 in that stretch, you might make it. And frankly, Sean, with a win against the top five team, they can. I think Tuttle gives the offense a spark. Where it goes from here, some people might say 9-3. Some people might say 7-5, 6-6. Maybe the truth is in the middle at 8-4.
And the opportunity is the key word here. And with all these teams losing, Joe, we really don't know like what's going to make up the 9, 10, 11 teams in the college football playoff. Who knows? Michigan looks really good the rest of the way and loses a tough one at Ohio State at 9-3. Like that might be plenty. That might be enough easily. And they could lose 4 of the next 6. It's just we talked about it last week. Is this sort of after the USC game, rather 2 weeks ago? Is this sort of play style consistent enough for winning? And it's a lot of close games. You had a field goal win over Minnesota, and you had a really close loss here. And I do think they will compete with maybe almost anyone except for Ohio State. When you play close games, you're really, really playing the margins, and a costly turnover here, or a missed, or a drop, or anything like that, or a missed holding call by the officials might be the difference between a win and a loss. And unfortunately, it's just, are you really going to win every single close game? I think probably not. But get a bye week, and then at Illinois, you win that, you're back in the top 20, and then who knows where you go from there. So, but here's what I'll say, Joe. I think they may have brought him in too early, actually, because they gave him too much time to adjust. And pretty much the whole fourth quarter, they had Tuttle's number. But I say if you put him in the start of the second half, maybe you run the clock out before they are able to adjust. Just a thought of mine. But Jedd Fisch, impressive for Washington, and the middle of the pack here in this conference show is looking very, very crowded. The last game of the day, potentially one of the bigger upsets of the weekend, not just in the Big Ten, but in college football. It's PJ Fleck's Minnesota Golden Gophers. They knock off Lincoln Riley and the USC Trojans 24-17 in Minneapolis. We talked about Minnesota being 2-3, rather, and they're playing a lot better than that record. And Joe, they get the job done here. Max Brosmer takes 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter to turn a 17-10 deficit into a 24-17 victory. You impressed with Minnesota here, or more shocked by a really big letdown from the Trojans?
Well, it's election season, so here's the most politicians' answer.
Both.
I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah. No, I think Minnesota's a really tough team. While we criticize Max Brosmer's decision making and certainly some of his costly turnovers early on, this was a game where he displayed his toughness, and I really think that this was the Darius Taylor game. A lot of Minnesota fans maybe weren't expecting in this spot, but this version of Darius Taylor's more the one they thought they were going to get the entire year. Leading receiver, leading rusher, 144 yards, 5 catches for 56 yards. That's not to be looked over. And they did it while Daniel Jackson only had 4 receptions for 36 yards. There wasn't, while 15-19 is impressive, they only passed for 169 yards. They just didn't make the fatal mistake like they made against North Carolina, certainly in the middle of that Iowa game, which is why that game got out of hand. And they didn't have anything resembling the first half they had against Michigan, which was probably their worst half of football all year, Sean, including the second half against Iowa. So I'm really impressed with PJ Fleck to be a team with 3 losses going into October and to play like this with this effort and toughness. I think is really indicative. And transferred over to USC here. I thought they did some nice things. I think their running game is still a lot better than a lot of people expected. But at the end of the day, Sean, Miller Moss, I'm not going to count the last pick against him because that was a desperation throw, and the kid made a great play on it. But 23-38, I did not think that they did a solid job protecting him. While Minnesota only had, I think, like 1.5 or like 1 sack, Miller Moss didn't have a heck of a lot of time. 23-38. no receiver over 55 yards. That's not how USC is going to win games, Sean. And I'm more stunned about this game than any other game we saw this weekend, believe it or not, aside from like a Vanderbilt over Alabama. I think every other upset this weekend had plausibility to it, except this one and the Vanderbilt one, Sean. Um, the only thing I might attribute this to, and we'll talk about it maybe on a different segment, all these teams from out west that have gone to the Midwest have lost. And I don't think USC is a worse football team than Minnesota or Michigan. And at the same time, I think if Michigan played Washington on a neutral, and again, to be clear, none of this matters. The only games that matter are the ones that are played on Saturday. I don't think Michigan's a worse team than Washington either. I think there's something to that. Now, you could scream how Indiana destroyed UCLA, and I think most logical college football fans would point out the flaw in that argument. But for this upcoming week, Sean, we're going to talk about it. I'm really intrigued to see Minnesota go to UCLA, who they're clearly better than. I'm really intrigued to see Ohio State go to Oregon, who maybe not clearly, but I think a lot of people view as better than them. And then Penn State, who most of the country views as far better than USC. I'm really interested to see if there's something to that early on in this era.
And Joe, when we talked about USC's schedule, this was their only road game against a Big Ten West Northern Midwest school, where you figured the weather could be bad, the offense might not look pretty. That's kind of exactly what happened here. This is the sort of game you saw USC getting upset in at the beginning of the year, to be honest. A game where it's really physical, it's really ugly, and this was the one, this is their only one. Maybe they get away with it. Well, they didn't. And they go on the road to Maryland, they go on the road to Washington, UCLA, and they host Notre Dame, and so they don't really have another game against a road game against a Big Ten West team. So like the Iowas, the Wisconsins, those sorts of teams. So this was the one that they had to avoid. And while their college football playoff hopes aren't completely gone, they are seriously diminished with this loss because they do have a couple of tough games the rest of the way. All right, Joe.
Sean, I do have to
go
go
ahead,
for 30 seconds. I think Sean, while I'm gone for all of these 30 seconds, is going to walk us through the slate we have coming up, which is a really good one. I will be back and on screen in under a minute. You can time me.
All right. Well, October 12th. This day was kind of touted in the beginning of the year as maybe the best day of college football ever. And it turns out that October 19th might be better. That's in week 8. But still, week 7 here in the Big Ten is a really good one. It starts on Friday. And then a couple of teams on bye, but we've got two, the number 2 team and the number 3 team playing, and then Penn State, the number 4 team, going on the road at USC. But we'll start with Friday's game. It's Northwestern at Maryland. I don't think Joe is really killing to get his word in here, but Maryland is 10.5-point favorites, and ultimately they should roll Northwestern here if they're serious about winning any kind of games. Joe, I just went through Northwestern Maryland on Friday night. I advise the viewers if, spend your time watching college football on Saturday rather than Friday night. Maybe Friday night's your time to get in your TV show that you missed during the week or to watch something else, because this is on Fox at 8 o'clock, but Maryland double-digit favorites at home. If this goes their way, this will be ugly pretty quick.
Yeah, Sean, I'm not imagining this will be a blockbuster game. I think Billy Edwards can show out here. But I will say the one thing I'd caution the viewers against is to heavily bet Maryland 10.5. This seems like a perfect game where Northwestern comes to play and Maryland doesn't. And let's face it, playing Northwestern at home in a half-empty stadium isn't really going to fire most guys up. So it could happen, but I do fully expect Maryland to be in control of this game and to not be in real danger of losing.
All right, Washington at Iowa. Big noon kickoff on Saturday. Noon. Iowa, 2.5-point favorites here, Joe. You have to think that these teams are pretty well balanced. And now it is at Kinnick Stadium, so you have to give Iowa the slight edge. But Washington coming off a big win, Iowa coming off a big loss. Something's got to give here. Somebody has got to do or maybe Washington keeps rolling, maybe Iowa doesn't. But big game here. Iowa wants to get back on the right track. Washington wants to keep the momentum going.
Yeah, Sean, I don't know if this applies to the theme of the West team coming to the Midwest. I really
I
don't want
think
to
it
make
sure
this,
does.
but I do think it's something to consider. I think Washington, from a psychological perspective, found itself. I think offensively and defensively, they made every big play in that game they had to make against Michigan. And against Iowa, you're going to have to continue that theme. Iowa's not a team you could turn the ball over against. And I understand Will Rogers uh, did not have a propensity, has not had a propensity, sorry, had a propensity to do that all year. I think the Ernest Hausman pick again is something he's just washed away from his memory. I think it's completely fine. I think that's what it's going to come down to, Sean. Is Washington going to make a critical mistake like they have in the Rutgers and Washington State game? And a part of me says no. I don't love the fact Iowa's favored. I do think it's teams spiraling in completely different directions. And maybe I use the word spiraling a little loosely with Iowa. I think they did some good things against Ohio State, but this is probably as big a game for Iowa as ever. I think if they win this, like we said, with their remaining schedule, they're still in contention for Indianapolis in that second spot in the Big Ten title game. And for Washington, this is one of your more winnable games, and I hesitate to say that because this is not a game like a game on the road where you're not favored. It's not a game where you're like, oh, that's a more favorable one. But Washington's riding this momentum. I think they should take it as far as possible. I think they're not playoff contenders. I expect most of their fan base knows that. And with that said, they're really playing with house money. So I think with that mindset, maybe a little looser like they were against Michigan, if they play that way, Sean, I don't see how Washington doesn't win this. The only way I see it is if they make that critical mistake. And if they do, I think Iowa wins. But if you're going to force me to give an answer, I do think Washington pulls off a semi-upset and beats the Hawkeyes to get to 5-2.
Yep, I think Washington will win too. We're gonna be able to tell really early on if Iowa is kind of rolling with their run and limited passing attack, reduced to third and long pretty much. It's be tough to come back on them. And Washington is a good offensive team capable of doing that, but if Iowa, punts 3 or 4 times to start off the game and then Washington scores, then Washington might look good. But Joe, you were in the stadium for Washington's game, so you didn't hear this from Noah Eagle, the broadcaster, but Jed Fish is really buying into the new way of football in the Big Ten. He mentioned to Eagle that he's not really playing 40 to 35 games anymore, and Fish was at Arizona before, still in the Pac-12 like Washington, but they're really buying into this new sort of style of football, and we saw it last week when they beat Michigan 27-17, and I think that even more so is going to be the case here with Iowa. This might be first to 20, definitely first to more than 20, and I think Washington gets the job done. The other game at noon, Wisconsin heads to New Jersey to play Rutgers. Noon on BTN. Same thing, Joe. Here, the home team, the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, favored by 2.5. Wisconsin coming off the big win against Purdue. Rutgers looking to bounce back after their first loss of the season.
Aside from the new Big Ten member coming slightly more to the east, this has a very similar theme to the other game. Wisconsin rolled. Now they're visiting a team that had one of its more disappointing moments, and obviously the first loss of the year for Rutgers. So I think this is a game Rutgers has to go back to what's been working. They do have to establish the run, and I think against this Wisconsin defensive line, they can do that. I would advise Anthony Kaliakmanis heavily about turning the ball over in this game, considering if the chalk holds in this, I expect Rutgers to win by anywhere from like a touchdown to like 10 to 13 points. So 7-13 would be my margin. Is Braden Locke going to be comfortable against the Greg Schiano defense? I think that's something we're going to have to consider. I do think Rutgers is going to throw a lot of pressure at him. I think Rutgers is not going to allow Wisconsin to have the big plays they had against Purdue and USC the week before. So that said, Sean, I think Rutgers does win a relatively close. I think 40.5 total over-under is a really good one because I expect Rutgers to win by the margin of somewhere between like 24-20 or 24-17. I just think Kyle Monangai gets back on track, and while Braden Locke does do some good things, I do think Rutgers is going to keep him out of rhythm the entire afternoon.
And Joe, Wisconsin really has played like one maybe close game, the USC game where they're winning at halftime, but they end up losing by 3 possessions. They haven't really played like one of those typical Big Ten games where it comes down to like a field goal or a turnover, and I think that might be exactly how Rutgers wants to play this game in the teens, first to 20. And I do think that sort of style favors Rutgers, and I think the Scarlet Knights probably by one score, but where it's their Rutgers is winning the whole game, and Wisconsin just happens to score late to cut it to 3 or something like that. But all right, 3:30, big game number 1 of the weekend. Number 4, Penn State. James Franklin's crew heads out west to the Coliseum to face a suddenly desperate USC Trojans team who are at 3-2. This is 3:30 on CBS. Joe, big game here for college football playoff implications. Penn State gets the job done, and they are looking awfully good for the college football playoff. And USC, for any hope, they have to win this game too. So Penn State -5 at this moment. I've seen it fluctuate depending on where you bet, but Penn State heading as decent-sized favorites on the road here to a desperate team coming off of an upset loss.
Sean, the narrative you just laid out is usually the perfect recipe for an upset. But I want to get outside of the two narratives we've talked about. One you just did, and the entirety of the Michigan-Washington and the East going to the West, because I think that's just going to get overblown over the next few years. Matchup-wise, I think Penn State defensively, it's their defense versus USC's offense. Lincoln Riley versus Tom Allen / James Franklin. Is Lincoln Riley going to scheme up a game where Miller Moss is more comfortable because they know Penn State's going to pressure? They know they're going to hit Miller Moss a bunch of times. Is Miller Moss going to be able to stand back there the way he did in the second half against Michigan and really get in control of this offense? I think USC, I don't love that they're as big as 5.5-point underdogs on some books. I think this is a game where if they were 4-1, they might actually be favored. I think them losing to Minnesota is a somewhat deceptive trick. I think a lot of people, casuals, are going to hammer Penn State. I think USC, this is more of a coin flip game than ever. Even ESPN's matchup predictor analytics has USC at a 52% chance to win. I think going off that's a little lazy, but USC's offense against Penn State's defense, Penn State hasn't seen an offense that could beat them running the ball because Woody Marks could do that. And Miller Moss has plenty of weapons at his disposal. One thing Penn State's corners haven't done is seen multiple receivers who could beat them. They've seen one or two, but no one who's really been... They haven't seen multiple weapons on the field at the same time, Sean, all of which are lethal when given the opportunity. Defensively, I think USC is still improved. I think some of their tackling has been piss poor of late, but I do think Penn State has to prove they can throw the ball deep. Because if they take away Tyler Warren and the run game gets stifled at a certain point, it's going to be on Drew Aller to make these pass plays. I do think he's matured a lot as a quarterback. I think he's improved. I think this is the game where it's going to be ultimately put to the test. And for Penn State, I don't think this is as huge a game as it is for USC. Penn State, this is a house money game. You win this, and like Sean said, your chances of the playoff are probably in the 70s or 80s. But if you lose, they're also probably in the high 50s, low 60s. I think there's plenty of opportunity on their schedule. I don't think they're going to be favored to lose in any other game besides the Ohio State game. So lots of opportunity for Penn State, but I do think USC on life support does get it done. I think offensively they use their weapons a lot more creatively, and perhaps they play the way Washington did, a little more fiery, a little looser. And I think their defense ultimately puts Drew Aller to the test and makes him beat them deep, something I don't think he does quite yet. So give me the Trojans in this. The over-under is 50.5. I think that's a little low. I think USC wins a 34-28 kind of game.
Yeah, I think USC is going to win it as well, Joe. And it's going to come down to those plays, not really the off-schedule plays, but sort of the face adversity plays for Miller Moss and the USC offense. Penn State really hasn't faced an offense yet that can keep a drive going after a holding call or a sack or something like that. And usually that means something like that happens and Penn State gets the ball back. That's not necessarily the case with Miller Moss and USC. So, look for USC to get a couple third and medium, third and long conversions to keep drives going, because that's what it's going to take. USC will probably have to get to 30 to win this game, I think. I don't know if a mid to low 20s game sort of suits them, maybe a high 20s, but I think USC gets over 25 first and 230, and I think they win this football game Not relatively easy, but at the end of the day, you look at it and say, they deserve to win this game. They did win this game. All right, Joe, we got potentially the most lopsided game of the weekend here. Purdue going on the road to Brett Bielema and Illinois. The Fighting Illini are nearly 20-point favorites here, Joe. And you have to say that might be a little light after recent results from the Boilermakers. 3:30 on FS1. Not a lot of eyes are going to be on this one with the other game going on, but Illinois just needs to avoid disaster here, and they'll pick up another W.
I'm gonna have three messages. One, Illinois off the bye week with a great coach like Brett Bielema. I don't expect them to.
They're coming off a loss, too.
Yeah, I don't expect this game to be very competitive. Even though Ryan Walters is like Brett Bielema's protege, I don't think that really means
Purdue did
anything
win
other
this game last year.
yeah. Other than the fact that it's a revenge game for Illinois and the fact that some newspaper writers in Champaign and West Lafayette are obligated to put that in their little editorial. So aside from that, that's the end of message one. Message two is Illinois does play Michigan the next week, so I don't think they're going to want to show too much on film, but I think they're going to want to get these guys out of this game in a hurry if the opportunity presents itself. And number three, my message would be this: don't be a headline. With the amount of headliner games there are, not only in this conference but outside the conference, Ole Miss, LSU, Red River, the list goes on and on. Do not become a headline on October 12th, because if it's a headline for Illinois, it's likely that they lost this game or played so bad that it's worth writing about on a national level. I highly doubt that will be the case, but don't even let it enter the fray of possibility. Those are my three messages to the Illini, because there's zero reason this game should be close or even close to becoming a loss for the Illini.
Yep, and I think if you might even go further with Illinois spread if you really want to watch this game and put it on. Illinois should win this game by 30 and maybe even 40 if Illinois is really a good team. Worse teams than Illinois have beaten them by more. All right, Joe, the big one. Saturday night. Big Ten Saturday night on NBC. 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Ryan Day and his Ohio State Buckeyes head out west to play Dan Lanning and his number 3 ranked Oregon Ducks. It's 2 versus 3. It's 5-0 versus 5-0. A potential Big Ten championship berth on the line, most likely here for the winner. The loser will likely not be in the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State heads out west as more than a field goal favorites. How do you see this one going?
God, this is the toughest game to predict because I've been consistent that Ohio State is the best team in this conference.
And they still might be, even if they lose this.
Yeah. I cannot shake the stupid narrative of teams like Michigan and even to a lesser extent, I know this is really dumb because it was over a decade ago. I've seen really good Michigan State teams, particularly in 2014, go out west to get smoked by teams that were not 22 points better than them. I've seen Ohio State teams late in the Tressel era go out west to get smoked. I saw a better Michigan team lose to Washington just because of a few fatal mistakes. I can't shake that. For no other reason, I have to pick Oregon to win this game. And what it's likely going to come down to is this. I think Ohio State's defense is not going to let up. I don't think they're going to let up any major plays. I think the decision-making and poise of Dylan Gabriel is ultimately what's going to win Oregon this game. I think Jordan James is going to have just a small number of big runs, but just enough to get Oregon over the edge. What it comes down to is I think Will Howard's going to have to use his legs a lot in this game. There will be times where his receivers will be covered or where he's going to have no other option but just to keep it on a 4th and 1 or a 3rd and 1. I do think Judkins and Henderson have some big plays, but I don't see any guy necessarily going crazy in this game. I think Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Ibuka have capabilities to do that in any game against any team in this country. I just don't think Oregon, Dan Lanning, or a Jim Knowles, frankly, on the other side, are going to let anyone, and I mean anyone, go off for more than like 120 total yards outside of any of these quarterbacks. So I really think Oregon wins this only because this is at home. If you put this on a neutral field, I do think Ohio State is a touchdown to 10 points better than this Oregon team. It's just college football, man. I do have to go with that. I would not be surprised, and I'll put it this way. If this game is a blowout, it will be Ohio State. It will be Ohio State blowing out Oregon. I just do not foresee that. So for that reason alone, I'm gonna pick the Ducks. Jordan James, big game. Dylan Gabriel connects on a few big passes to Stewart, Tez Johnson, and I do think Oregon wins this game. Give me them by a score of 35 to 20. 35 to 30. I think Ohio State, what does them is they don't finish certain drives and they settle for field goals.
I'm going for Ohio State, Joe. I think it might be a little bit uglier of a game than Oregon might want. Um, Only one team has scored double digits against Ohio State so far this year, and Oregon has, you know, they weren't able to shake Idaho. They weren't able to shake Boise State. Now, that's over a month ago at this point, but um, I just think Ohio State's a better team, and if they can start off the game well and keep the crowd out of it just a little bit. I know it's one of the best atmospheres in the sport, but I think Ohio State's defense is what gets them across the line here. Defense travels on the road, and they have two great running backs. They have two great receivers. I just think they narrowly get this one. Maybe a good start by Ohio State. They're up 2 scores, then Oregon claws their way back and makes this thing a game. But I think Ohio State gets the job done. All right, Joe, the last game of the week. Definitely not one that's going to be in the record books, but it's Minnesota coming off a big win, 3-3. Great opportunity to get to 4-3 as they head out to the Rose Bowl to play UCLA, who is 1-4. Minnesota goes at -5. Real good opportunity to get over 500.
Yeah, the biggest favorite of an original Big Ten team going against or a traditional Big Ten team, not original for Penn State, but the biggest point spread uh, for a pre-2000s Big Ten team to beat a Pac-12 team. I, I'm not going to preview this game too much because I do think Minnesota should just ride Darius Taylor, Marcus Major, throw the Daniel Jackson when it's necessary, and have Roseburg take care of the ball. If they do those three things, I don't see how Minnesota doesn't run away with this game. One thing I'll caution against is Justin Martin was extremely impressive against Penn State, and I understand the 3 effective points doesn't move the needle by any means on a national level. I do think at home he's going to be able to do a lot more against Minnesota. I don't think they'll be able to pressure him the way Penn State did. I don't think he'll have to rush as many decisions, and I do think they'll throw more at him and toward his disposal this week. So I think this game could actually be really close. And the way I'll predict this, Sean, is I'm not going to predict it, but what I'm going to say is of the 3 games out west where the Midwest team is favored, I think in 2 of those 3 games, you're going to see the Pac-12 teams win, whether that's UCLA, USC, or Oregon. I think 2 of those 3 teams do pull off the, I guess, against Vegas upset. So that's all I'll say for that. I think it's going to come down to if Justin Martin can not massively, but marginally improve, and Minnesota makes 1 or 2 mistakes that they've been prone to in the month of September.
Yeah, and Minnesota has been a team that, you talk about them being better than their record. You can't lose this game if that is true. If you want to make a bowl, if you want to be in the top half, it doesn't get much easier than this in the Big Ten. No disrespect to UCLA, but at the end of the day, it'll be a big letdown for the Gophers if they don't get the job done here. All right, Joe, that's our Week 7 preview for college football. In our last segment of the day here, we're switching over to basketball for the first time of the year. The coaches' poll came in a couple days ago, and we are going to bring it up here. I really hope it loads in. All right. Okay. And it's not quite big enough. Let me make it a little bigger here. All right. Purdue, top of the pile. 21st place votes, 572 overall points. Joe, are you surprised to see the Boilers up top?
Not at all, Sean. I think they frankly deserve at this point. It's going to be the big question that's going to be posed to them all year. Is the loss of Zach Edey going to be that detrimental to Purdue? With Matt Painter, who's been, let's face it, Sean, in the 2020s, he's been the most impressive coach in this conference. So I think he gets the benefit of the doubt. I'd like to talk about the second place team more, but I'm going to turn the floor to you right now.
Before we go off Purdue, Joe, Braden Smith is the Big Ten Player of the Year. He's the only returning first team player. Not much of a surprise here, considering a lot of pretty much all of the best players in the conference from last year are not back. So,
Yeah.
up second, Joe, the Indiana Hoosiers. Many people are already touting this as an Indiana versus Indiana type season in Big Ten basketball. The Hoosiers come in with 7 first place votes at 549. With the talent that Mike Woodson has at his disposal, really anything outside of the top 4 will be a big disappointment.
Yeah, Sean, I think Indiana in this conference, I think they're often touted to have the best transfer portal haul in terms of quality. Now, quantity, you could go maybe a Michigan, Ohio State. I do think Illinois also had a sneaky good offseason, which we'll talk about in a second and on later segments. But Sean, Indiana, this has to be Mike Woodson's best team and most anticipated team going into the year. I don't think uh, going to the round of 32 is going to be very acceptable to most of this fan base. Malik Renew, Miles Rice, Trey Galloway, Mackenzie Mbako, Umar Ballo, Luke Goody too. I mean, not even mentioning a Gade Cups or a Bryson Tucker. That's an impressive roster in and of itself. So, Sean, they're ranked 30th in Torvik. I don't think that's a fair ranking. I think they're a top 25 team easily. I think you could even argue a top 15. It's just how quickly they gel together into the Big Ten play. I do think, looking at their December schedule, I'm just pulling it up. I don't know how favorable their early on schedule is, but
Atlantis will be tough.
yeah, I think the team is going to have to grow in a hurry to achieve top 3 in the Big Ten. But I do think come March, they're going to be a top 5 team in this conference in terms of like if we power rank them, for example.
And we will do multiple power rankings for basketball throughout the season, too. And we will do a full-length preview, but we're just kind of reacting to the coaches' poll here. Joe, Mick Cronin's UCLA Bruins are third. Now, there's a whole lot of quotes to come out of Big Ten Media Day, and if you really want to, you can go into the rabbit hole. And basically every coach says his team is great. But Mick Cronin took a little bit of a different approach. He went in and basically said that, we don't have any of the bad players from last year. And the coaches poll is reflecting that. A third place finish for UCLA would be pretty impressive. Now, outside of the top 2, that will be many people's top 2, but after that it gets a little messy. UCLA at third and Illinois at fourth. A lot of turnover from last year. Illinois, the Elite 8 team, and UCLA, the team that missed the tournament. A lot of turnover there. Both of these teams will look a lot different this time around.
Yeah, I think what it's going to come down to is are Lazar Stavanovich and Dylan Andrews going to produce even more so than they did last year for UCLA. We could talk about the travel thing. That's the last thing I will mention it because that's going to come into effect. Sean, I think outside their top 3 projected scorers of Stavanovich, Andrews, and Mack, if they could have one more guy step up, I think this team could be really dangerous. I think that's what separates them between, frankly, Sean being a 3 to a 6th place team to even winning this conference. I don't think enough people consider that possibility enough. And I think UCLA, should a Kobe Johnson play better? Should an Eric Daly Jr. really live up to his potential? Should one of those guys also step up to help these big 3, for lack of a better term? I think UCLA could be one of the more scary teams, not only in this conference, but in the country.
And we're not going to go through every team, Joe, because that would we could do a whole episode on that, basically.
Totally.
But Rutgers and their 2 freshmen, Steve Peichel brings in 2 of the top 3 freshmen in the recruiting class. They come in at 7th. You have to say the coaches are respecting Rutgers without those 2 having played a single point of college basketball.
Yeah, I think between Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper, I think they're really expecting those guys to contribute. I think Tyson Acup is an underrated acquisition in the portal. I think a lot of
he could score it.
I think a lot of really big schools threw their hat in the ring there for a reason. So I think we'll talk about Rutgers more at length, but I think a lot of their other acquisitions in the portal are going to help them even more so than just the freshmen.
And Joe, the last team I want to talk about here is a team that does lose probably the second most important player in the Big Ten from last year, and that's Northwestern. Boo Buie moved on. He just signed a preseason camp deal with the New York Knicks. But, Joe, other than that, they do return about 2/3 of their minutes and points. They do get a pretty highly ranked transfer in Jalen Leach from Fairfield. But, Joe, the coaches do not see this season going very well for Northwestern. They are down in 16th. This one was the most shocking for me.
Yeah, Sean, you take a look at this roster: Brooks Barnheiser, Ty Berry, Nick Martinelli, Matt Nicholson. These are names we've seen on Northwestern's roster for more than a few years now. Even the start of this podcast kind of feels like amazing we're still talking about them. Um, I have not seen Jalen Leach play much. I'll defer more to you on that. But overall, Sean, this does not seem like a team that's going to have like to finish 16th. You might have to have 5 or 6 wins in the conference in 20 games. I don't see that for this team. I see them being a huge problem at home. I see them being an even bigger issue on the road. It's in road games where the team doesn't show up to play. Let's face it, Northwestern doesn't get the respect they deserve. You see Northwestern as a fan or even maybe as an arrogant player, and you don't necessarily get so fired up to play that game. I do think that should change, and I think because of that, because of that unfair stigmatism, Northwestern has an advantage in a lot of these games. I do think I'll make this bold prediction. They won't finish 16th in the conference. I see them more in the middle range of anywhere from like 10, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's where I see them. So really shocking and frankly, pretty disrespectful to Chris Collins, one of the longer tenured coaches in this conference, who's done nothing but make Northwestern a better place and a more respected basketball power in the Midwest. Maybe nationally that's too far for now, but as of now, really shocking.
Yeah, Joe, I will have them much higher than 16th. And Jay Leach, his stats do not do his game justice. He was injured pretty much all the time his first 3 years. And so I would throw those out. He had his first full healthy season, and he was unbelievable. Definitely very close to the conference player of the year in the MAC. And he's going to be a problem. He's big enough to do some damage in the Big Ten, probably about 6'6", a true winger. And that goes with Brooks Barnheiser and Ty Berry, who are also pretty big guards. So I think they might cause some issues defensively for whoever has to cover them, because they have 3 really good wings, and a lot of teams have 1, maybe 2. And, one of them will probably have to be the point guard, and they don't really have one because Ryan Langborg and Boo Buie are out of town there. But maybe that's why they're 16th, but I will have them much higher, and I think by the sound of it, you will too. But, Joe, that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. A little bit of a longer one. We are going to get the college basketball previews rolling soon, so 50 episodes down, Joe. Hopefully a bunch more to go. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.